Good afternoon and welcome to episode 9 of Perspectives on Sustainable Development. I am Chris Whitehead, your host, and today we're talking about an interesting topic that I frankly want to learn a lot more about: environmental and social governance, or ESG, as it's also commonly known. As I almost felt like, as I said those three letters, I should have had a dun 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 going in the background. Um, ESG is a term that hasn't been around too terribly long, only really a couple of decades now, but it's touched almost every aspect of industrial lives, and it's most often tied to, well, a couple of things, but actually responsible investing, and then also how you address climate goals and how, as a company, you show yourselves to be acting responsibly. And I am not an expert in this topic whatsoever. There are about 1,000 other ones I could speak to more cogently than this, but we're lucky, and I love this format of the podcast because we could bring on friends of mine who just do this day in, day out, know it cold. So when I started putting this episode together, the first couple names that popped into my mind said yes. And I'm very, very fortunate and happy that they did. And I've been looking forward to doing this episode for a bit now. And I know that I'm going to learn quite a lot. And I hope everyone here does as well. And on that note, too, this podcast was started to be an educational resource for people and to be high quality free education for those who might not be able to afford to go to engineering school or graduate school for these topics, but still want to get the Cliff Notes version and get up to speed, so to speak, in a relatively small amount of time. So I've started to hear stories coming in about public schools picking these up and them being folded into curriculum. And frankly, nothing can make me happier. And if by chance anyone actually listening to this has a story like that they want to share, please send it in. I'll think of something to do with all of them at a later date, but just understand that every time I read one, it's extremely gratifying. So with that, I think I'm going to jump straight into it. Please welcome our two guests today, Christine Uri and Matt Sekol.
Hello, I'm Christine Uri. I am the founder of ESG for In-House. I am a lawyer by training. I practiced for a long time, and then I spent 10 years at a Fortune 500 energy company where I worked as the chief legal officer and the chief sustainability officer. So I had a dual hat in a company that was really spending a lot of time focused on climate change. When I left that company a year ago, I really wanted to spend some time focusing on helping general counsel and chief legal officers make progress on their ESG goals within their companies. There's kind of a transition happening now where a lot more legal folks, including general counsel and chief legal officers, are getting involved in this space. And I just want to find ways to make it more approachable, to make it feel like something that companies can make progress on, and to help companies meet their goals and targets.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And my name is Matt Sekol. It's great to be here. I'm a sustainability global black belt here at Microsoft. And what that means is I focus more on the commercial side of sustainability. So I talk to companies and Microsoft's partners all day long about their sustainability challenges, about ESG. I came into this space from supporting capital markets here at Microsoft and kind of having a front row seat just as ESG was really tipping over from the financial markets into the corporates, which has always been kind of the focus of ESG. I've written a new book. It came out in May. It's called ESG Mindset. It talks all about ESG. It's a great primer. Christine was kind enough to do an early review of it. And I also write I try to do weekly ESG newsletter called the ESG Advocate over on Substack. And I really consider myself to be, if you check me out on LinkedIn, I'm very much a benevolent troublemaker because I always am trying to ask as many questions as possible about this topic.
And frankly, I think that's great. And I first started following your stuff on LinkedIn that probably 2, 3 years ago or so. And Christine, maybe a touch before that. but just know that I go to you quite a bit for this type of stuff. Obviously, my company has people in-house too, and we have clients who we help certain things with. I'm curious, and I guess to just get started a little bit, because both of you have been into this for a while now. How has ESG changed since you first started being involved in this type of work to where it is currently?
Matt, do you want to go first on that?
No, sure. Yeah, I absolutely can. So, I've had a pretty long career. I was mostly in IT prior to joining Microsoft. And so I didn't really even know what ESG was, frankly. I'll be completely honest. When I joined Microsoft, I was partnered with some of the world's biggest financial services firms, some of the world's biggest ESG data aggregators, and I was instantly enamored with it. What bothered me about it, though, was that it was strictly a financial services tool. It was a perspective that they were using to assess companies. In some cases, the companies, the investments, risks, and opportunities. In some cases, it was going into kind of the sustainability space a little bit more, or like DE&I, like non-important matters, but not really material matters. And like companies didn't really get what this was. They were publishing CSR reports, sustainability reports, but now it seems like over the past couple of years, since COVID, since George Floyd's horrific murder, since the extreme weather events have started creeping up into the global north, companies are starting to actually understand this outside of the financial services perspective. And even I'm optimistic to say that even in the rash of greenwashing from the anti-ESG push that's been going on over the last year, there seems to be like a reckoning of, boy, these issues really do kind of matter to my company. And, I might not be talking about it as much publicly, but I am going to kind of have this ESG mindset when I'm thinking about these issues in the context of my company. So I'm kind of optimistic about it in the way that it's transitioned from the financial markets into the companies that have always been the targets of this.
That's interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong too, but didn't ESG first come around in, I don't know, 2003, 2002, something like that? And it was associated with the Millennium Development Goals. So there was always the hook into impacting climate change, but then primarily on that financial and responsible investing perspective.
It was born out of the UN Environmental Programs Finance Initiative, which is a mouthful, right? And they really thought that looking at these material issues was a way to drive capital into solving some of these bigger problems. And I think very much that they were right, but I don't know that it really ever quite got to the volume that it could have reached up until 2020 when things started tipping over. Yeah.
So
Interesting,
before
Christine.
I give my answer to the question, I want to jump in, Matt, and I want to ask you a really controversial question. So just put you on the spot here. How do you define ESG today?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I define it very specifically in the book, which is why I wrote the book, Christine, as you know. So I define ESG as the material, environmental, social, and governance risks that affect a company and the opportunities that drive towards long-term value and sustainable growth. So and in the book I talk about this, there are ways that the company's externalities and its impact on the world can come back to kind of hit the company. But ultimately, we're talking about these things that affect the company in some way, whether it's regulatory, whether it's fines, whether it's social sentiment and reputational risk, whether it's physical risk like climate change, all those things.
Fantastic. Yeah, I was joking a bit there because among kind of ESG practitioners, there can be hot debates on that very basic question. Perfect. I'm so glad that you started with your answer to that, Matt, because my background is in kind of the opposite side, on the company side. So I did not grow up professionally in the financial markets. I went in-house at ENGIE, which is the energy company I mentioned, in 2013. And I was part of their program, and it changed its name over the years. So I'll talk about that from the very beginning. But when I started kind of internally working in a large company, it was really referred to as corporate social responsibility. There wasn't, this investor perspective that Matt's talking about. It was mostly for kind of employee satisfaction and community, giving and that kind of thing. So in the early days, and that's typical for a lot of companies of that era. And this is even at a company where we were advising companies even in 2013 on how to reduce their carbon footprint. So early in on that climate measurement, but in terms of our internal programs and how we look at our processes, we're talking about CSR. And then we shifted. And this was, I think, part of what was happening in a lot of companies, kind of looking at sustainability. Really, when climate started to heat up, and looking at it from a more of an impact standpoint. I saw this. I feel like there was a moment in 2019 where all of a sudden companies were coming out and they started making these really bold climate statements that were kind of exploding all over the place. Some of it had to do with the Trump administration, and the decision to pull out of the Paris Agreement was not well received by a lot of American corporate leadership. So there was a push to kind of counteract that. But it was, really under a sustainability umbrella. And then what's happened in the last few years, Matt, was talking about how this was growing within companies, is a lot of that. There's two things. One, investor and B2B client perspective started coming in to companies. And I think this is mostly, for the investors, it was, I guess, two different things. From the investor perspective, the ESG factors really started to seep in as a measurement of value, and companies were seeing, oh, investors are, partially evaluating me based on these characteristics, so I better pay attention to them. So that was, a piece of why companies started to look at this broader environmental social governance. And really, when you're talking about environmental social governance, the difference, I think, between a sustainability umbrella, which is I view as an umbrella for ESG, and then ESG itself. ESG is really, about measurables and metrics and reporting and those kinds of things that hold companies accountable to investors. And so companies began to pay a lot more attention to that kind of metrics and reporting. And as soon as you're, reporting on something with metrics, then the drive is to improve it. That is the nature of business. So that was happening from an influence on the investor side. And then on the client side, once companies started to adopt these climate targets, and particularly net zero targets, there's something in the carbon measurements, and you can get very wonky on carbon measurements very quickly. But there's an aspect that requires you to take in mind the emissions of your supply chain. And in order to do that, you had to go out and ask your supply chain for their emissions. So all of a sudden, the questions that companies were getting in terms of their ESG performance from their clients expanded. There's this whole push around the climate emissions, but then it kind of grew and grew, and now companies are getting more than 100 questions from clients across the ESG spectrum on their performance. And when clients start asking for those things, just like when investors start asking for those things, companies start paying more attention. So today, we have a situation where you have investors and clients driving a lot of this, and then we can get into regulations if you want. I'm a lawyer, but there's a whole global regulatory context going on as well.
That's really interesting, Christine. You alluded to scope 3 emissions there, and I wonder if you'd agree with me on something. Paraphrasing here, of course, my background for the audience is actually air emissions, working air quality technically. So when you talk about metrics and stuff, my ears start perking up. But then just thinking about it, trying to quantify scope 3 emissions is tough for a lot of reasons. And I always kind of thought, do they really care what the scope 3 emissions are, or is it just to put pressure on these other firms who haven't had to think about this stuff before? Because the exact number, in my opinion, almost doesn't even matter. But getting people involved in this type of work matters a hell of a lot more.
Does who really care about scope 3 emissions?
Just my opinion, if you give the federal government an exact number for a certain process, okay, but any good attorney could poke holes in that, say, oh no, it's not this, it's not that. Uh, Counting scope 3 is tough. Double counting is extremely, extremely possible, that type of thing. So I'm just asking if the exact number matters.
Well,
Matt, do
yeah.
you want to go? Go for it.
It matters in some cases from a regulatory perspective because companies are expected to attest to that information. So it needs to at least be auditable and on par with like financial information.
Yes.
But ultimately, and I've written about this in the past, although I don't think I wrote this in the book, carbon is not universally material. So like it doesn't necessarily matter equally across a supply chain or even to companies. Even in the same industry, it's not quite the same because you might have like companies that have little bits and pieces of different business units or set up differently, or to your point, Chris, like different business processes that maybe avoid emissions in a way that, you know, your company doesn't. So it's what's interesting about what Christine said was ESG very much was born out of this need for comparable data. In talking with investors recently, as this data has started to become exposed, especially like scope 3, they're finding that it's not quite as comparable as they wanted. And the reason ranges from, well, you can't compare a company like Netflix and Disney because while they're both streaming company, Disney has all of this other stuff going on with its parks and its IP and everything else. So you can't quite get as comparable especially for the company, but outside in the supply chain as financial services, I think initially expected out of the gate, which is why like ESG is really interesting because those issues are not universal. Like carbon isn't necessarily universal, but what might be universal for a Netflix and Disney? And maybe it's, you know, diverse content, for example. Maybe it is to some extent emissions in its technology stack for streaming. Like maybe that is a part of it. So there's like pockets of it, but we tend to focus on carbon specifically. And I just don't know. And granted, this is a big problem that needs to be solved. However, it's not universally material.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, I think what is universally material is whether a company's leadership is managing its risk or not.
Yes.
And and so I talk with clients often who may not have, you know, carbon footprints that are material to in any sense of global emissions or climate change or whatnot, but you still need to measure it and your executives need to be able to talk about it and you need to have a plan around it because it is a major global risk and your investors and your clients will expect that. So what your starting number is, it kind of is what it is. But what you're looking to do as a company is show, okay, we have a handle around it. We're capable of measuring it. We can talk about it. And we have some kind of way that we're planning on reducing it. Because ultimately, you know, if you're starting at a point, you're measuring it somewhat correctly, and you're reducing it over time, then globally we are getting to where we want to get on climate change as a world. And from a financial perspective, your investors can look at it and be like, okay, this management team, they're paying attention, they know what they're doing, and they're measuring their risk and they're balancing it and they're making progress. And that's fundamentally with any of the ESG measures, you know, what an investor wants to see.
Yeah, I have to call something out that you said, Christine, because I haven't considered that before. But effectively, what you're saying is the governance processes around managing a company's material ESG issues is universal. And that could be the only universal pillar out of the three. Every company needs to focus on these issues. So I love that. Governance is kind of universal around this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's encouraging. And just I guess this might be going back just a bit, but just talk about the metrics again. I would assume that the exact metrics to track ESG would probably vary based on the sector, right?
Yeah, I mean, and there's frameworks for that. So like what used to be SASB, but is now Value Reporting Foundation, has some what they consider to be material. GRI, which is another standards organization, is intended not to, they have gotten into materiality lately, but originally was intended kind of to be a guidance on standardizing the metrics that you would report if these issues were material or you were looking to report them, but you had to kind of provide that materiality context. So very much so. These metrics can be, they can be all over the place.
Yeah. And you have to keep in mind, I mean, environmental, social, governance, that's three really big areas. You know, climate tends to be the 800-pound gorilla at the table right now. But for any particular company, you know, that its exact metric, that may or may not be the most relevant or material metric at the table. And for you as a, you know, company, as an executive team, as a board, you have to go through and look at these and figure out what is really relevant to your business. You know, you might be in a business where it's safety. You know, that like
Yeah.
you might be in a business where you have a high risk of loss of human life, and safety is should be your number one focus. It doesn't mean you ignore everything else, but there are other metrics. And what I try to do with my clients is say, okay, we're not going to measure everything, and we're not going to report on everything, because if you try to measure and report on everything, you know what's going to happen? You're not going to make progress on anything, because you're just going to be measuring and reporting on it. So let's find a few that matter. Let's find and I challenge them, you know, three tops issues that really matter, and let's really focus on those things instead of trying to say we're going to do 20 things.
Interesting. And I guess I'm gonna paraphrase something I've witnessed quite a bit in the environmental justice work I've done and climate change stuff for the last few years. You have companies come to you and essentially want to treat this like a check the box exercise. And then you have other companies who understand that's a longer game than that, and it's actually inherent risks and things like that, and want to be a little more proactive. How do you go about this type of conversation with potentially a first-time client who you've never spoken to before? How do you essentially lay the groundwork for starting today? How do you get in the best foot with these topics?
Yeah. Yeah, so what I found is usually when, with at least for my clients, when they reach out to me, they're at a pain point where they have to provide some kind of reporting or data for their clients or their investors, and it's become business critical for them. And the thing with reporting and data is you have to have some sort of basis for them. So if you're going to, you know, come up with a sustainability report of any kind, you have to have a decision on what's important to you. You have to first start, you know, I try to start with, like, let's look at what you're being asked for from clients, from investors, from employees. Let's kind of overlay that so we know where even the requests are coming from, and kind of what their volume is. You really do have to get in and educate the executive teams. There's a lot of times not a high understanding or an even understanding across executive teams on what these issues are. So, and that starts with education around, like, okay, why is this coming up now? What are investors wanting? What are consumers wanting? Why is this a material issue? Why is it, you know, not going away? Kind of setting that context. What's happening in the industry, and then, you know, what's happening at that company, and how to move forward with leadership. So there does need to be an executive conversation so that the executive team can then weigh in on what are the material issues that we are going to take on at all, and kind of kick things off. And then getting into, once you get through, you know, identifying what's important to your stakeholders, getting your executive team involved, and then building a strategy, and then you can kind of get to solving your reporting challenge that you have for investors and clients and whoever else is asking for it.
Interesting. Um, I've heard people, I have to be extraordinarily general here, obviously, talk about ESG, sustainability, environmental justice, essentially as marketing efforts. Why is it more than that?
Mhm.
Oh, why is it more than marketing? Oh, go ahead, Christine.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, for a long time, sustainability and ESG were just marketing. I mean, in CSR days, that's largely what it was. These teams lived within marketing. It was about coming up with, hey, we planted 100 trees on our Earth Day, or those kinds of things. And it was buzzy, fluffy brochures, and so that. And for some companies, that's still the case, but kind of through this process that Matt described, the business community kind of has come to realize, like, oh, these are actual both indicators of our financial performance and impacts on our financial performance by, are we managing our risks and also our opportunities? I mean, the world is changing in fundamental ways. I know, Matt, you could probably talk about how Microsoft is addressing this in terms of it, trying to figure out how to provide carbon efficient data services to its clients, which I'm sure is an extraordinary challenge. But there's market opportunities in here. And there's also the need to manage risks. And imagine if you're a manufacturer and your main facilities are in tropical low-lying areas. I mean, that's a major risk that you need to be managing against. So I think there's been this process where for a long time it truly was marketing, but as businesses have realized that it has business impacts on the numbers, they've come to be embracing these programs in a more substantial way.
Yeah, there's definitely the side that is like, for a long time, it was the marketing. It kind of moved into like reputational risk, because you kind of manage these issues and therefore manage your reputation, because you can't really manage your reputation, right? As an intangible, you have to manage kind of these issues that surround it. But companies are kind of realizing, because crises are hitting them, like things are happening in the world that are, oh my gosh, geopolitical risk. There was an article in the FT this week, the Financial Times, about the rising prices of food is likely going to be a sustained issue, which means any consumer product good company needs to understand how, what their financials are as the climate changes and impacts not only a hurricane coming through an area and maybe wiping out a crop, but like crop diseases that are happening, droughts that are happening in entire countries, flooding that's happening. Like, there are really big problems that are hitting these companies now that can no longer be avoided in the rise of globalization. Even with onshoring, like in some cases, onshoring might make this worse, because now you're bringing everything back home and you only have one fail point. So like, companies, in looking at these issues, I think they're starting to realize that they can get ahead of some of this. And the company that understands this, at least, like, even just understanding it and thinking through these issues gives them an edge, because when these crises hit them, at least they're prepared with something. Like, they've thought through, what does it mean when this happens? What does it mean when Russia invades Ukraine? Like, who could have predicted that, right? Like, that was a huge issue that completely disrupted, like, grain supplies and prices. So the company that kind of understands its ESG issues is setting itself up for long-term resilience. What's challenging is getting the board, whose job it is to understand resilience, to see that this is a path to resilience. That is a little bit more challenging, because that marketing mindset is really in there. It really is like,
Yeah.
oh, I'm going to grab a consumer market, or I'm going to grab a B2B market, to Christine's earlier point, because they're asking me for this information. And it's like, well, yes, but there's also this entire universe of risks that are hitting you, or opportunities that you can capture that your competitors are going after. Do you really understand what that is? And it is core business stuff, not necessarily outside of the norm, let's say.
Yeah, I think you said business reputation, and it brought me to another kind of interesting facet of this marketing question, is how the change in how we communicate has affected this. So if you go back even to the 2000s, companies had a lot more control over their message, their reputation, their dialogue, because people were just not, videotaping things and throwing them on TikTok every every day. And you see this, companies have been there's less and less, and one could argue no control or ability to manage your reputation simply by hiring a good PR company, which you used to be able to do. But now you have to take your reputation management and make it much more substantive, because anyone that you interact with, or that it can take a video and throw it online, and then you are in crisis mode dealing with whatever that issue of the day is. So that at the end of the consideration, what you really need to be doing is making sure your operations are sound, making sure that in advance as a leadership team what your position is, and being willing to stick with that position through crisis is critical, because you can't just make up stuff on the fly in these positions, or if you do, it'll be messy. We saw that with the DEI and George Floyd, a lot of companies coming out with really aggressive commitments that frankly they're not living up to, and it was because they just got caught out of without having any kind of plan, and had an inordinate amount of pressure. I mean, I was a chief legal officer receiving those letters and requests for public statements and all that. I know exactly how that feels. But you, as a leadership team, that's where having a strategy, knowing what your values are, having thought about these things in advance really, really pay off.
Yeah, I love that consistency that you said, because I think that is so important. Because again, it's governance. If you don't have that consistency and you start making reactive decisions depending on what's going on social media that day, oh my gosh, all you're going to be ever doing is reacting to social media and things like that, and you'll never get any business done.
Yeah. And it really, I tried to drive this message, and this, Matt, of focusing down, and I have a whole minimum viable reporting framework that I like to use to really focus companies down. But what I really want to see with all this is that the resources that companies have to focus on ESG, putting them somewhere that matters. And so in order to do that, you have to be able to say no. And an example, you might be a SaaS company with a remote workforce, and you might have a client that's, for whatever reason, really passionate about water, and is really pressuring you for a water commitment or a water measurement. But the fact is, your employees are washing their hands at home. That's it. And so you have to be willing to have that conversation with that stakeholder, where you're like, we've looked at this, we hear your concern. This is not a material issue for our company for these reasons, and we are focusing on these other issues which are material for our particular business. But that takes you having a stance in order to be able to give those no's, instead of just buckling and trying to figure out spending your time chasing down numbers that don't really exist.
Yeah.
And I guess to push back a little bit, Christine, you said something a little bit ago that is difficult to really protect against reputational harm. I'm sorry if I'm paraphrasing you there, but the thing that comes to mind first is the potential effects of greenwashing. And there are obviously, if you look back objectively through history over the last years, pretty easy examples of companies trying greenwashing. And then just what type of harm does that do to them hypothetically if it was a site in Boston doing it, but because it's tied to the same company, the sites in Texas and Kansas and wherever who are trying to do it the right way, be with their communities, do everything that they're supposed to. How much does that one bad incident kind of spoil the well?
So you're giving an example where a company that might have many locations has an issue at one particular location.
I thought of it because of the point you brought up before about the effects of social media and how fast things get out.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And so you can have a very small incident as a company relative to your overall portfolio, have a brand impact across your entire brand. And that was something that was, I was at a global energy company. We were doing business in 20 countries, and anything brand risk related, shot to the top instantly. because today, smaller incidents can have outsized impact depending on how it's reported in the news media or on social media. The things that as a leadership team, you have to be aware of that. So what that is kind of part of doing business today. Put in place as much as you can to be a responsible business and have your data points, your point of view around that you can share. And then when you have a crisis, because you will have a crisis, have good crisis communications to manage that from the first instance. And part of that is usually around acknowledging what the situation is, not going into overpromising immediately, getting a proper investigation off, being able to communicate with your stakeholders responsibly, talking about, the other things you're doing in terms of your business to kind of balance out your reputation. But absolutely, you have to be expecting and prepared for small incidents that could have company-wide brand impacts.
Yeah.
Interesting. The other thing that came into mind when you were talking just then, I have a relatively small client in California who, going back, I don't know, 10 years or so, thought they were doing the right thing, bought carbon offsets. Now, fast forward 7, 8.5 years, ballpark, they're essentially being yelled at because they bought carbon offsets when they thought they were doing the right thing. How can things like that change over time? And how can companies like my client guard against that to know as best they can that they're doing as best they can? I'm not sure if you understand what I'm asking there, but yeah.
100%. I'll let you go first, Matt.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So yeah, carbon offsets, man, they are quite controversial at the moment. Because if carbon offsets were a solution to our challenge, we'd be fine because we're buying things that already exist, which is why they're controversial, right? What I think companies can do is leverage carbon offsets in a legal way to, lower their overall emissions as much as possible, but they can't ignore the work. And that is what is critical to understand. Microsoft got into this. There's a white paper out there. I can't remember the name of it, but we launched an RFP for carbon offsets because we invested in some offsets and like the forest burned down. And what we found was that we were going after like 80% of the carbon offset market just because we're so big. So it's a really interesting read. I can't remember the name of it, but if you look for Microsoft, the carbon offset white paper, your readers can find it. But in the meantime, again, you cannot avoid the work. So the defense against, hey, you guys are just doing offsets, is to do the actual work and communicate with your stakeholders on that work so that they understand how you're actually transitioning. And the case that I always bring up is, people want activists, sustainability activists often say, like, we got to shut off fossil fuels. We do have to transition away from fossil fuels, but there are like very marginalized communities in the global south that do not have access to green energy, that we cannot shut off fossil fuels because their hospitals won't work and they won't have lights at night. Like, this is not like a binary thing. And I think carbon offsets kind of bleed into that conversation a little bit because it's not just doing one or the other. It's doing a mix of things to help the company grow and transition to be more sustainable and resilient over time. Communicating that is key, though. But Christine, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree 100%. But I see another aspect to the question, which is just how, the terminology and the expectations in this area are constantly shifting. It's new and it's changing, and there's different expectations. You really saw this with, the carbon neutral kind of commitment. And I know Microsoft was big out front on carbon neutral and then carbon negative, and really, I'm clearly trying to do the right thing and lead in these areas. And then all of a sudden, poof, we have all this, controversy over offsets. And, we could probably do a whole episode on our opinions around that controversy. But it is a very challenging dynamic for companies because the meanings of these terms, that's why I was asking Matt what ESG meant, is shifting over time. The expectations are shifting over time. And the best you can do as a company is to stay aware of that and know, like, be able to say, hey, we're really committed to doing, the top of the market thing 10 years ago. And we went out, we bought the best offsets that you could get. And we did that for 6 years. And, we've learned over the course of that time that maybe this isn't the right action for our company. And so at this point, we are shifting over to do PQR, but realizing that there's not going to be one right path from here to world net zero in 2050. We're all going to have to continue to evolve. And I'm the it's a bit unfair to companies. I tend to be a company kind of person or mindset. I hope that understanding in terms of the media and the consumer markets and so forth evolve that to realize that companies, even that they, when they are doing their best, this is an evolving market, that you can't, it's not something that it's just has been around for 100 years. It's not like tracking a revenue number where there's a solid, a gap accounting system and everybody should be able to do it. Companies have to be able to learn and adjust and have some adjustments over time.
Yeah, I think that's right. And also, just kind of as you alluded to, Christine, focusing on the macro versus the micro. And although I hear the frustrations with a lot of the smaller clients we work with, like, hey, again, we were trying to do the right thing. We thought we spent a heck of a lot of money and now we're getting bitten because of it. Still focusing on long-term goal might ease that a bit, for lack of a better term there. We're starting to come up on time a little bit, but there's one more other big topic I wanted to ask you both about. I think for this one, I'm going to start off with Matt. How is artificial intelligence going to affect ESG? And I get asked this by various people focusing on my air emissions background because it's a little bit of a counterintuitive thing for the possible learnings and benefits and stuff and breakthroughs that AI could bring. It's also can be pretty carbon intensive, but bump up emissions profiles, take a lot of energy. How do you balance all that?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, this could have been the whole episode. So I'll try to be succinct. Um, in the book, I kind of write about technology having two sides to ESG. One is as kind of a fourth pillar with its own risks and opportunities, because like the other pillars of ESG, technology has become foundational to every business on the planet, pretty much. But more interestingly, with this rise of generative AI, with large language models, and with frankly, like there's been an increase in attention to machine learning. So machine learning really focuses on the quantitative side, and then you have these large language models that can focus on the qualitative side, and you have ways that you can tie it together. What we're really seeing, and this is the official Microsoft stance, and I think it's pretty good, which is we're seeing that there is a benefit to AI from a sustainability perspective. Now, I'll get into the social in a bit. There's three reasons that we call out. One is kind of personalizing skilling around sustainability and ESG to the person who's taking the training. That means specific industries, specific context, so that they get the skills that they need to understand this topic. The other two are kind of more practical and impactful, I think, which are finding material substitutions for high emitting or high water use or high environmental impacting like components of your product. So Microsoft research, we used quantum computing and AI to figure out that we could potentially replace up to like 70% of lithium in lithium solid state batteries with sodium, which is abundant, easy to get, and things like that, which is currently moved into real world testing. The last one is operational efficiencies. So leveraging AI to kind of find the patterns that the people aren't finding and bring, operational efficiencies to a factory floor, to a retailer, whatever it might be. Now, on the other side, there are a lot of potential risks and harms, and this hits both the environment and the social. AI today is about 4% of global emissions. We are expecting it to rise, as are the other hyperscale cloud providers, as companies begin to use it more and more, which means we need to transition our supply chains. And for us personally, a lot of the emissions sit in construction of new data centers. So it's also increasing like the density of data centers and things like that. But then on the social side, we need to make sure that our models, and we need to educate our customers when they're building their models to avoid things like bias in the model. So we have, and again, many of the hyperscale cloud providers do this. We all have like responsible AI frameworks that customers can look at to say, well, am I making sure that there's not bias in my data before I go launch this thing that's going to scale up to a massive market? So there are nothing but complexities and considerations. But what I'd say is, if you've figured out how to kind of think through your ESG issues, you likely already have a framework to think about AI from because it's the same, it's ultimately the same risks and opportunities, same complexities, same interconnected relationships as all the other pillars. So leverage what you've done to kind of hopefully stand up a good ESG program and apply it to AI would be my advice.
Yeah. So lawyers are all over this. Might be surprised, not over figuring out how to make green data centers or anything super useful like that. But we're spending a lot of time on AI governance. So companies, and a lot of folks will put this in the G of ESG. I don't really care whether you call it part of ESG or not, but companies do need to be on top of their AI, because frankly, there's already a lot more AI functionalities running around in companies than they even realize, and that provides a door into having some of the some biases that you may not intend, having some work product that maybe it wasn't your intended result. So AI can be tremendously beneficial. I have my little own AI searches running up for the work that I do. I'm sure I'm adding to the carbon footprint related to that. And there are many more, vastly more useful applications of it. But companies fundamentally have to be aware of the AI that is entering their systems through different software, or that they're engaging, or that their employees are engaging, and understanding how that impacts training their people on how to use AI responsibly, and thinking really, ahead of how do you manage risks, and where is this going. So this is another area. And the bad news for companies is that all of these areas are just adding in complexity. From Matt mentioned the geopolitical kind of lens that's become tremendously more complicated, the technology lens. And so it is a challenge for companies just to continue to get better and be better.
Yeah.
On that though, too, I think Matt alluded to this as one of the larger potential benefits from artificial intelligence is material substitutions. And I understand that one definitely. But can you think of another?
Can I think of another example of how AI is material?
Or just that, or possibly said another way, and I'll pull that part out. But can AI think of ways to solve potential problems that it might also be causing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Like if there's yes, I think that is probably one of the more interesting benefits. And I mean, one of the base examples I think would be if somebody turned AI over to like researching fusion energy. Like that is on the horizon. Microsoft has made a big investment in a fusion energy company that's supposed to come online by 2028. But like having an AI, even expand out the early successes with fusion to see what's potentially feasible would help solve one of the biggest issues, which is energy use.
Yeah.
Well, like there are ways that it can help solve its
Yeah.
own problems, I think. But to Christine's point, and I was getting at this with the responsible AI, but she really nailed it, which is your board really needs to understand this topic and kind of layer on governance controls over top of it. And there are a ton of governance frameworks out there for AI specifically. So If you suspect that AI can help you solve some of your either sustainability challenges or entering new markets with marginalized groups, make sure you absolutely apply some sort of governance control to it first, so that you understand what you do, how you continue to look at it, like have feedback loops, make sure you're monitoring your stakeholders, for example, that it's not causing some sort of harm. And then you can find, I think AI can help you transform yourself and the world pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And responsibly.
The other area where it strikes me, and Matt, you could probably talk about this more than I could, but it seems like adaptations, that's got to be a huge area where AI could be very, very helpful. I mean, and adaptations, and we all know that the world is changing. Climate change is baked in. This will, we're talking a lot about climate change, but this is going to impact nature, and biodiversity is the next big wave of environmental issues that are coming up. Like Matt was mentioning, you have crop impacts, and there are so many different ways in which the world is going to have to adapt that are beyond one human brain to conceive. So it seems like predictive models on how we would have to adapt and how we can do that. I mean, I would encourage Microsoft to just go after that, because that seems really important.
I'll make some calls. You know what? It's funny.
Yeah, perfect.
It's funny that you mentioned adaptation, because you're totally right. Right now, the world's companies and largely governments are focused on mitigation which is what's behind all this measuring that we're doing. But the adaptation is largely going overlooked. And there are some climate models that can inform adaptation strategies that leverage AI, that do forecasting. But I don't see a lot of companies focusing on them. And I know for a fact that adaptation is not the focus of, the COPs and the investment that central banks do. But you're totally right, Christine. It is a very overlooked issue where AI might be able to kind of scale and bring some attention to it before a disaster happens, helping people like redo their land so that when a wildfire comes through, maybe it doesn't destroy the buildings there and keep people safe. Like, those are great use cases that I think are largely overlooked today.
Yeah, it's really
I
interesting.
have a sheet in here. My little brother is working on a PhD in adaptation in India. So
Oh,
I I have an inside view there.
Well, I gotta tell you both, I was right. I learned a lot in this hour or so we've been chatting. And I always end each episode with a version of the same question. And it's, can you recommend any resources for people to learn more on these topics? And we covered a lot in this hour, but is there any particular author or scholar or someone you would recommend definitely who looks at these things objectively? And then as a second part to that question, if you look at demographics of people who've been paying attention to this podcast thus far, it's industry and academics and all that, but then also a very, very large chunk of young people, college students, grad students. What advice would you have for them?
Well, you have to read Matt's book, ESG Mindset. I have personally reviewed it, and it is, there are usually, I say this in my review, like I almost never recommend ESG books because frankly they're dated before they get out the door, and they're very, they're not very interesting. But Matt did a fantastic job. So in all seriousness, check out his book. The other one that's really circulating and has influenced some of my idea is Allison Taylor's Higher Ground, that everybody's been talking about this that year. Allison, she's not a big fan of the term ESG, but I do think some of her ideas in there are very influential. So you may want to check that one out as well.
well, you already did my plug, so now I'm not sure what to do. But I would.
Well, how do you say read my own book? I was doing you a favor there,
No,
Matt.
actually, I'll tell you what, Matt. I'm gonna figure out how to do just a big red circle and arrows across the book, just so you don't have to.
You do that.
Perfect.
You do that. One of the things I would encourage everybody to do, besides read my book, is, there are a lot of great companies out there who are publishing ESG reports, and they put ESG in the title. If you come across ESG written reports, don't just look at it for the metrics that they're publishing, but look at it through a learning lens and try to figure out like, how did they operationalize this internally? And you can usually, in the governance section, sometimes they tell you what they've done, but really try to use those ESG reports to learn what others in your industry are doing, and then take those lessons and apply it to your company, to your thesis, whatever it might be.
Yeah. I'm looking over here to the right because I actually do keep a list somewhere that I didn't have teed up for of resources that I recommend too. So and I've posted on it before, so I can send that over as well.
I appreciate that. And that's actually the type of thing I like to add to the episode notes. So if you find that, send that over and I'll be happy to add it.
Yeah. I can never think of them off the top of my head, but I intentionally like add things in because I do get this question quite a bit.
Sure. Absolutely understood. Well, again, thank you both. I've had a lot of fun. It's a great episode. And for everyone listening, be sure to stay tuned next time too, because if you haven't been paying attention, there's been a fair amount going on in the courts recently, and we're going to have Tanya Nesbitt and Mike Showalter on to try to catch us up in about an hour. So that should be us talking extremely, extremely fast to cover everything. But as usual, follow us on all of the podcast platforms. And thank you, everybody, for the tremendous support to date. Because, again, this has been an extremely fun side project for me. And I love the conversations we've been having and just trying to inspire collaboration among people who love talking about topics that they're passionate on. So with that, both you, Christine, Matt, thank you very much. And I think we're going to call it.